Joining me now, David Becker, Executive Director and co-founder of the nonpartisan Center for Election Innovation and Research. With me here in studio, Charles Coleman, former Brooklyn, New York prosecutor and an MS Now legal analyst. David, you wrote a book on the efforts across the country of voter suppression. How does what we saw in yesterday, to your mind, in Georgia, fit into the bigger picture?
Well, I think it's much less about 2020 than it is about 2026 and 2028. We know what happened in 2020. What happened was our nation's election workers, Republicans and Democrats all across the country, and particularly in places like Georgia, somehow managed the highest turnout in American history in the middle of a global pandemic. And their work has withstood more scrutiny than any election in world history. Dozens of courts, including judges appointed by President Trump himself, have reviewed this. And in Georgia specifically, with all paper ballots, those paper ballots were counted 3 times, 3 different ways, once entirely by hand to confirm the results. We've known what the results were in 2020 and subsequently ever since those elections occurred, thanks to the diligence of election workers. But I do think there is some concern that this is an effort to spread disinformation about the security and integrity of our elections that'll be used to cast doubt on future election outcomes that are not preferred by the president.
Charles, just this week, a federal appeals court threw out a challenge to Georgia's election law. But as Atlanta's NPR station puts it, quote, the decision leaves in place the ability for state election board to take over underperforming county election boards. Where do you think all this is heading?
Well, Chris, I think context matters here. And one of the things that I want people to remember is that perhaps the biggest failure with respect to our federal elections was the inability of Congress to get past the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. It passed in the House, and then in the Senate in 2021, it died because of a filibuster. If that passes, none of these conversations are happening. And the reason I say that is because the Voting Rights Act was the one tool as a civil rights attorney that I stood up and held up that would prevent all of these restrictive voting laws that we see trying to be pushed through state legislatures on the books. Now, fast forward, when you're talking about the midterm elections and everything that we're seeing across the country with the wave of very restrictive voter registration and voting laws that we're seeing, a lot of it is really about flooding the zone with confusion, where you are trying to restrict the ability and the access of certain groups to the ballot box. And ultimately, this is going to come down to the judiciary if Congress is not able to, which is very, very unlikely, do something about this before that time comes. And so it is about creating confusion, it is about limiting access, and it is about abridging people's rights to vote.
So the big question, David, is what can be done to stop efforts to restrict people's rights to vote? We heard today a question that was asked to elections officials in Atlanta about whether or not this was some sort of effort to cause a problem that the feds could point to and say, you're not capable of running your own elections. Where do you see this going next, and what can people do about it?
Yeah, I agree that there are efforts, particularly by the federal government right now, to interfere with our elections process and perhaps even to inspire fear amongst voters. But I'll tell you, I'm optimistic. I think that those efforts are going to fail. I think what we've seen in the last 4 federal general elections, 2018, 2020, 2022, and 24, is record turnout in all of those elections, despite unprecedented challenges, a ton of disinformation being aimed at American voters, and of course, a global pandemic where we saw the highest turnout in American history. I am confident in the American voter that they're going to push past this. And my message also is, despite efforts to restrict the vote, the reality is it is more convenient to vote in the United States, and in Georgia specifically, than it ever has been in American history. 47 states allow early in-person voting more than ever before. More people have access to voting by mail without an excuse than ever before. Both are available in Georgia. If anyone has any concerns that they might be profiled or targeted, I don't think that's going to occur, but they get to choose where and how they vote in almost every state, and that's a huge advantage that the American voter has.
Well, that brings me to this question, Charles. According to the Brennan Center for Justice, at least 16 states enacted 31 different restrictive voting laws last year, and 30 of them will be in effect for the midterms. Is the answer maybe vote by mail if you possibly can? There are people, I know this because I've walked those lines on Election Day, and people said, it matters to me to be able to stand up. For a lot of people of color who say, my grandmother, my grandfather fought so I could stand here. I wanted to be here in person, but what does a person do?
Well, the first thing that a person should do is to make sure that they are registered and checking the rolls way before Election Day. And one of the reasons for that is being able to cast a vote, being able to mail in a vote is only half of the battle. You want to make sure that that vote is actually counted. And I think that that's a part of the discussion that we sometimes miss. And so making sure that you have the right credentials with respect to being registered, your address matching whatever ID you may have. If you live in a state where that is a situation, it should not be. But to be prepared, those things to make sure you haven't been strict from any role, and also to make sure that if you are encountering these problems, that you are reaching out to your local county of elections and their board of elections to make sure that you are reporting these problems. Have you been removed from the rolls? Is your address wrong? Are you not registered? Are you registered for the wrong party? All of these things you should be checking in advance so that when you go to the polls, should you decide to do that, or when you vote by mail, or when you vote early, everything is in order. And most importantly, Chris, that vote gets counted.
David Becker, Charles Coleman, thank you both so much.